What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
You can love someone and still want to strangle them, especially when that someone is your little brother, the one you used to sneak Pop-Tarts to under the table when mom forgot to pack his lunch, the same one you bailed out of summer school and later out of jail, the one whose entire adulthood has been a collection of almosts, not quites, and can you help me just this once, until the just this once turns into a running tab you can't even track anymore. Dylan was always a proud man with nothing to be proud of, and I guess that's where it all began. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, right around 4 in the afternoon. I was standing in the checkout line at Trader Joe's with a cart full of overpriced cheese and a bottle of Riesling I didn't even like but bought out of habit when I saw the message pop up on my phone. No, happy early Thanksgiving, not even a passive-aggressive emoji. Just a one-liner, like a slap across the face from someone who hadn't earned the right to hit you. He wrote, "Don't come to Thanksgiving. We don't need your pity money." That was it. No punctuation. No warmth. Just those words, direct and cold and unmistakably intentional. I read it twice before the woman behind me nudged my cart forward, and I realized I was holding up the line. The cashier smiled, scanning my cheese and wine like nothing had just snapped in my chest, like my own brother hadn't just shoved a knife through 10 years of unspoken sacrifice and twisted it without so much as a thank you. I didn't respond. Not right away. I didn't scream or cry or start typing out a paragraph defending myself. I just stood there, paid for my groceries, walked to my car in a daze, and sat behind the wheel with the engine off for almost 15 minutes. And in those 15 minutes, I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but out of something colder, something more dangerous. I decided to give him exactly what he asked for. No pity money? Fine. Then no money at all. I went home, poured myself a glass of the Riesling, and opened my banking app. In 2 clicks, I canceled the recurring rent payment I'd been sending to Dylan's landlord every month for the past 3 years. It wasn't even under his name. He was months behind when I stepped in, and I took over the lease just to keep the family from getting evicted. His pride couldn't handle it, so I did it quietly, like most of the things I've done for him. Birthday presents for the kids? From Dad. New tires after the snowstorm? Just lucky timing. But make no mistake, behind every emergency he survived, I was the one holding the net. When I canceled the payments, I didn't feel powerful. I didn't even feel justified. I felt hollow. But I nodded to myself, closed the app, and poured another glass. Thanksgiving came and went. I stayed home, made myself a plate of roasted chicken thighs and box stuffing, and watched reruns of Frasier until I fell asleep on the couch. I didn't text him. I didn't call Mom. I didn't even check social media to see what photos they posted from the family dinner I wasn't invited to. I sat in the silence of my decision and waited to see what would crack first, his pride or their foundation. It didn't take long. By the following Monday, I got a text, but not from Dylan. It was from Laura, his wife. Laura, the one who'd always smiled a little too tightly at family gatherings, the one who texted me behind Dylan's back every few months with veiled questions about how things are going and if the lease is still stable. She'd never said it outright, but she knew. Women always know. We don't need paperwork to tell us who's keeping the lights on. Her message was short, but this time, there was panic in it. "Hey Jess, did something happen between you and Dylan? The landlord came by. Said we're behind by 2 months. Please tell me this is a mistake." 2 months. Because I'd already paid through November and December. That was my buffer. I always planned ahead, even when no one else did. I stared at her message, rereading it with the same numb detachment I had when Dylan's came through. It's funny how silence can be louder than shouting, how a choice to do nothing at all can detonate a whole damn house. And that was the thing. I didn't want to destroy them. Not really. But there's a quiet kind of fury that builds up when you're always the one holding things together. When you're the sister who made it out and kept pretending that everyone else could catch up. When you're the one who got tired of being the bank, the therapist, the excuse, and the backbone, all without thanks, without acknowledgement, and, worst of all, without honesty. That message from Laura was the first crack. And I could already hear the sound of the walls groaning. And maybe, just maybe, that was what I'd wanted all along. Because here's the question that kept circling my mind as I sipped cold wine in the dark. If someone spits on your help, do you owe them anything when they fall? Now tell me, what would you have done? Would you have swallowed your pride and sent another check anyway? Or would you, like me, decide to watch what happens when the safety net disappears? Because let me tell you something, it didn't end there. Not even close. The silence only lasted a day before the phone started ringing again. And this time, it was Dylan. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that settles in your bones when you've spent years doing the right thing, not because it was asked of you directly, but because you knew deep down, without being told, that if you didn't step in, no one else would. That kind of fatigue doesn't come from the act itself, but from the silence that follows it, the lack of recognition, the quiet expectation that you'll just keep doing what you do, because you always have. I used to think that helping family was just part of loving them, that being reliable was the only form of affection I really knew how to show, but lately, I've started to wonder if I was helping them or just making it easier for them not to grow. When Dylan first lost his job, laid off during the chaos of the early pandemic days, I didn't hesitate. I still remember the phone call. His voice was tight, like he was trying not to let the desperation show, telling me that things were a little rough right now, that they just needed to get through the next few months. He didn't even ask for money, not outright. He just said, "It's hard with the kids home and Laura out of work too," and then let the silence stretch until I filled it with solutions. I offered to help with rent, just for a bit, I said. Maybe 3 months, tops. He didn't argue. He just said, thanks, and changed the subject. 3 months turned into 6, then a year, then almost 3. Somewhere along the way, the urgency in his voice disappeared, replaced by awkward politeness and passive updates. Thanks again, Jess. We're looking into some things, should have something lined up soon. But nothing ever lined up. The job interviews turned into rejections, the side gigs dried up, and eventually, he stopped updating me altogether. The payments became automatic, like a subscription I forgot to cancel. And if I'm being brutally honest, I didn't mind. Not at first. I liked knowing they were okay because of me. I liked knowing that I could swoop in like some kind of invisible guardian angel, keeping the roof over their heads while Dylan pretended he was still the man of the house. But slowly, quietly, that good feeling started to rot. I began to notice how Mom talked about Dylan during our weekly phone calls, how she painted him as this strong, devoted father who was just going through a hard patch, while describing me as so busy and always working. It didn't matter that I was the one paying his rent, or that I sent money every December so the kids could have a decent Christmas. It didn't matter that I'd covered a medical bill for Laura's emergency dental surgery, or that I replaced their broken washer without being asked. To my mother, I was the successful one, which in her eyes meant I didn't need anything, not understanding, not gratitude, not even inclusion. That's the part that stung the most. Not the money, not the ungrateful text, but the way the family seemed to rewrite reality just to keep their version of the story intact. In that version, Dylan was struggling but noble. I was wealthy but cold. He was doing his best. I was doing too much. But the truth is never that simple, is it? Because deep down, I knew I wasn't just helping out of kindness. I was helping out of control. Helping let me feel like I was still part of the family, even when I wasn't invited to birthdays or didn't get the inside jokes shared at barbecues I couldn't attend because I was working a consulting gig in San Francisco. Helping let me tell myself I was involved, that I mattered, that I was the glue. And I think a small, mean part of me liked knowing they needed me. Not because I'm cruel, but because I'd spent a lifetime being the responsible one, while Dylan coasted through life on excuses and soft landings, and now, for once, the power was mine. And maybe Dylan felt that. Maybe he felt it every time he cashed a rent check he didn't earn, every time he looked at his kids and wondered what kind of example he was setting. Maybe the anger in that text wasn't really about pity money. Maybe it was about the way I made him feel, like a child, like a man who couldn't provide, like someone being propped up by his older sister when he should have been standing on his own. I don't excuse what he said. It was cruel. It was ungrateful. But I understand it. What I don't understand is why Laura pretended not to know. When she texted me about the landlord showing up, I felt a flicker of something guilt, satisfaction, and ignored it. I didn't reply. I didn't call her back. I just watched as my phone buzzed again the next day, and then again the day after that. Her tone shifted from concern to panicked, and eventually to cold. On Friday, she wrote, "You could have just told us. We had no idea the payments stopped. We assumed we had until January." I didn't reply to that either. Because here's the thing no one talks about when it comes to family support. It's not always about generosity. Sometimes it's about leverage. Sometimes it's about rewriting old roles. Sometimes it's about watching the ones who never had to grow up finally learn what growing up feels like. I poured myself another glass of wine that night and read over every message she'd sent. Then I opened my email, searched for the name of Dylan's landlord, and scrolled down to find the automated receipts, every one of them, month after month, labeled rental assistance for Monroe residents. My name was right there, bold and impersonal, like I was just another social worker assigned to their case. And then I saw the most recent email, sent 3 days ago. The subject line read, "Final notice, intent to evict in 10 days. I didn't forward it. I didn't warn them. I just stared at the screen, letting the silence wrap around me like a coat I wasn't ready to take off. Because I knew something was coming. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one bracing for the fall. I was the one watching. And something about that felt almost peaceful. It's strange how memory works, how certain conversations from years ago can resurface with such clarity that they feel closer than the words you heard just yesterday. That week, as the silence between me and Dylan thickened into something you could cut with a knife, I kept thinking back to a winter evening nearly 15 years ago. Long before any of the rent checks or secret wire transfers or cold stares over mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving. We were sitting on the back porch of our mother's house, me nursing a glass of cheap whiskey I didn't even like, Dylan chain-smoking menthols like he was trying to erase some part of himself with every puff, and he turned to me with this tired kind of expression, the one he wore only when he thought nobody was watching, and said, "One day, we're gonna owe each other more than we can pay back." I laughed it off at the time, said something sarcastic about how he already owed me $100 and 2 years of stress, but even back then I knew he wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about history, about guilt, about things buried under layers of silence that never quite stayed buried. The message from Laura lingered on my phone like a stain I couldn't scrub away. Her words, "We assumed we had until January," had the kind of hurt in them that comes not just from fear, but from betrayal, from the shock of finding out the person you relied on had quietly stepped away while you weren't looking. I still hadn't responded. I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone and tell her everything, that I'd been funding their lives like some kind of behind-the-scenes producer on a show no one bothered to thank in the credits, but another part of me, the part that had grown calloused from years of being taken for granted, felt stubborn, almost vindicated. They hadn't wanted my help? Fine. Let them see what the world feels like without it. It wasn't until Friday morning that I broke my silence, not with Laura, but with someone I hadn't seen in weeks, my mother. I drove over to her house under the guise of delivering leftover Thanksgiving cookies I'd baked out of boredom, but we both knew that wasn't why I came. The moment she opened the door and saw me standing there, her face shifted from surprise to concern, like she could sense the weight in my chest before I even spoke. We sat in her tiny kitchen, the one that hadn't changed since the late 90s, same worn laminate counters, same rusted toaster, same chipped mug she always gave me because it was your father's favorite, and I asked her, point blank, if she knew anything about Dylan's situation. I expected her to downplay it, to do what she always did and wave it off with some dismissive comment about men needing time or pride or space. But this time, she hesitated. There was a flicker in her eyes, just a second too long, and I knew. She wasn't surprised. She'd known something, maybe for weeks, maybe longer. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, like she was confessing something not even God should hear. She told me that Dylan had taken out a personal loan in her name almost 2 years ago, without her permission. Said he needed it to cover some old debts, promised he'd pay it back within a year, but the payments never came. She didn't tell me because, in her words, he was ashamed, and I didn't want to make things worse. I stared at her, stunned, as the full weight of her words landed like bricks in my lap. He had used our mother's name, her credit, her retirement. And somehow, she was still defending him. I asked if Laura knew. She shook her head. He said he didn't want to worry her. That was always his excuse. Don't worry her, don't burden her, don't let her see the full mess. Keep things looking stable, even when the foundation was cracking like glass under pressure. I realized then that Dylan hadn't just been living off my help, he'd been patching holes with every relationship he had, stitching together silence and lies until the whole thing was hanging by a thread. I left that conversation feeling sick, not because I felt pity for him, but because I finally saw the full picture, not just the man who resented my support, but the man who had become a magician of sorts, making failures disappear behind the illusion of self-sufficiency, while quietly pulling the strings of everyone around him. He had made our mother complicit. He had made me a financier. He had made Laura blind. When I got home, I opened my messages again and, without much thought, typed a single line to Laura, "Can we talk? Just the two of us." She agreed. We met at a quiet coffee shop near her work, and when she walked in, she looked exhausted, older than I remembered, like the weight of her marriage was aging her faster than time itself. I told her everything about the rent, about the loan in Mom's name, about the fact that the eviction notice wasn't a bluff. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stared at her cup like it held answers she wasn't ready to face. "I knew something was off," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I just didn't know how bad it was." Then she did something I didn't expect. She pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and showed me a screenshot of a message. It was from a dating app. Tinder, of all places. The profile had a blurry photo, but the name was unmistakable. Dylan. Same age. Same city. Same job listed, contractor, even though he hadn't worked in months. The message read, "You seem fun. Maybe we both need a break from the drama." She said nothing else. Just slid the phone toward me, like she was handing over the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was assembling. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't have to. The silence between us said it all. And as we sat there, two women brought together not by loyalty or love, but by the same man's failures and deceit, I realized that sometimes the strongest bond isn't family or marriage or blood, it's truth. And truth, once it starts unraveling, doesn't stop. It keeps going. It drags everything into the light. And I had a feeling there was still more buried in the dark. I just hadn't dug deep enough yet. There's a moment, somewhere between righteous anger and cold, calculating resolve, where you stop feeling like the victim and start realizing you've been holding the match this whole time, just waiting for the right breeze to light the fuse. That's where I found myself the morning after meeting Laura, sitting at my kitchen table with the sun pouring in like nothing in the world was broken, staring at that Tinder screenshot like it was a crime scene photo, trying to decide if what I was feeling was betrayal or inevitability. Because if I was honest, and God help me, I was trying to be, part of me had known. Not the specifics, not the app or the message or the smirk on his face in that grainy photo, but the pattern, the decay, the slow unraveling of a man who had spent years pretending to be whole while quietly hollowing himself out from the inside. Laura hadn't cried in that cafe. She hadn't lashed out or cursed his name or broken down into pieces the way I might have expected. Instead, she had gone still, like someone who had just watched the last domino fall and finally understood the shape of the pattern. And I think that's what stayed with me, the stillness. Because it wasn't shock. It was clarity. And I knew, without her saying it, that whatever spell Dylan had over her was breaking, fiber by fiber, and soon there wouldn't be anything left holding her in place. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake thinking about all the ways people build their identities on illusions, how Dylan had spent years constructing this fragile version of himself as the dependable father, the misunderstood husband, the unlucky but hardworking man who just couldn't catch a break, while carefully burying every lie, every failure, every borrowed dollar behind that weathered smile and unshaven jaw. and how I, in my own way, had helped him keep it all afloat, not because I believed in him, but because I believed that my help made me indispensable. That by supporting him, I was proving something to myself, to our mother, to the ghost of every childhood argument we'd ever had. But now I saw the truth, and once you see it, you can't go back to pretending. And I didn't want to pretend anymore. I didn't pick up when Dylan called that afternoon, his number flashing on my screen like a siren. I let it ring out, and when the voicemail buzzed in, I listened, not out of curiosity, but out of some dull sense of duty, like a coroner checking for a pulse. His voice was hoarse, urgent, filled with the kind of desperation you only hear when a man realizes the floor he thought was solid has turned to sand. He said he needed to talk, that he didn't know what I'd told Laura, but things were falling apart, and that if I ever cared about him, really cared, I'd at least let him explain. Then, after a pause so long I thought the message had ended, he added, "You always wanted me to fail, didn't you?" That line stuck. It shouldn't have. It was manipulative, ridiculous even. But it stuck, because a part of me, some quiet, shameful part, couldn't dismiss it entirely. Had I wanted him to fail? Not consciously, not in any way I could say aloud, but had I wanted him to feel the weight of his choices? Had I taken some twisted satisfaction in watching the cracks spread across the carefully painted surface of his life? I didn't answer him. Instead, I got to work. I logged back into my email, pulled up the eviction notice I hadn't forwarded, and saved it as a PDF. I opened a second tab and found the contact list for Laura and Dylan's church community, the one they attended twice a month, not because they were particularly devout, but because Dylan had once told me it was good for the kids, gives them structure, he said. Though I always suspected it was more about optics than salvation. I sent the notice anonymously, no name, no message, just the document with the subject line, Monroe Family Residence. Urgent. I didn't do it to hurt him, not directly. I did it because I wanted the truth to do what I no longer had the energy to do myself, strip away the last layer of his performance. Within 48 hours, the effect was visible. Laura texted me once more, not to ask for help, not to vent, but simply to inform me that people from the church had reached out, that someone had offered a temporary sublet for her and the kids if things got worse, and that she was considering all options. The subtext was clear. She was detaching. Not from the situation, but from him. Her tone had shifted. No more panic. No more confusion. Just quiet, practical detachment, the kind you only hear from a woman who has spent too long waiting for someone to change and finally realizes they won't. That night, I received another voicemail from Dylan, but this time, it wasn't his number. It was an unknown caller ID, and the voice on the other end wasn't angry or pleading. It was calm, almost eerie in its restraint. "You don't know the whole story, Jess," it said. "You think you do, but you don't. Ask Mom what really happened in 2008. Then call me. Or don't. Either way, you'll understand." Then the line went dead. I sat there, holding my phone like it was made of glass, my mind racing back to that year, 2008, the year everything changed for me, professionally and personally. The year I got my first major promotion, left my marriage, and moved 3 states away to start over. A year I had always considered the turning point in my life, the year I finally took control. I never stopped to think about what that year might have been for Dylan. I called my mother the next morning, asked her straight out if something had happened back then, something she never told me. There was a pause. Then, with a sigh so heavy I could feel it over the phone, she said, "Come over. It's not something I want to explain over the phone." And, just like that, the narrative I had clung to for years, that I was the strong one, the responsible one, the one who had earned her place through hard work and integrity, began to tilt, slowly but unmistakably. Like a picture frame that had always been crooked, but I had never dared to straighten. Because if there was one thing I'd learned in the past week, it was that family secrets never really stay buried. They just wait, patient and silent, for the day you dig a little too deep. And I had just hit something solid. There's something eerie about revisiting a house you've known all your life once time and truth have pulled back the wallpaper and left the bones of it exposed. Something unsettling in how a place that once smelled like cinnamon and dust and burnt toast on Sunday mornings can now feel as foreign as a stranger's living room, cold in all the places that used to be warm, silent in the spaces that once echoed with laughter or yelling or the harmless chaos of family. I sat on the edge of the same couch I used to nap on as a kid, the same one where I cried into my mother's lap when I didn't get into my first-choice college, and I stared at her across a chipped coffee table like she was someone I barely recognized. Not because her face had changed, but because I knew deep in my gut that she had held something from me, something that shaped all of this, something that sat beneath our arguments and passive-aggressive phone calls and stilted holiday dinners like a stone under a rug no one wanted to trip over. She poured tea like we were about to gossip, not detonate a mine buried in the past, and when she finally sat down across from me, she didn't meet my eyes right away. She looked at the window instead, the one with the half-dead plant on the sill, and said, "You remember that year you moved to Seattle?" Her voice was quiet, not shaken, not even regretful, just measured, like she had rehearsed this in her mind so many times she'd drained all the emotion out of it before it ever reached her lips. I nodded slowly, waiting for the real story to begin. "Well," she said, "what you don't know is that right before you left, your ex-husband, Michael, was in an accident. A bad one. Drove drunk, hit a parked car outside a bar on Main. No one was hurt, thank God, but the police were called, and they were ready to file charges." My stomach tightened. I had never heard a word of this. Not from Michael, not from Dylan, not from anyone. Michael had been a mess near the end of our marriage. That much was true, angry, withdrawn, drowning in the failure of a startup and blaming me for every inch of his spiral. But I thought I'd left all that behind when I packed my things and started over. Apparently, I hadn't. Apparently, I'd just been kept in the dark. She kept going, her hands wrapped around the mug like she needed the warmth to say what came next. Dylan stepped in. He was working construction for one of the guys who knew the officer that responded. He called in a favor, paid off the damage, handled the lawyer. All of it. And he made sure it didn't touch you. Said you were about to leave and didn't need that kind of mess holding you back. Said he'd take care of it. I sat frozen, the weight of her words pressing against my ribs like they were rearranging the entire structure of who I believed myself to be. For years, I had walked around thinking I was the strong one, the one who had cut ties and made it on my own, who had clawed her way out of a bad marriage and rebuilt her life from scratch. But it turns out, someone else had been behind the curtain, pulling strings to make sure I had a clean stage. "He never told me," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "No," she said. "He didn't want you to know. Said if you found out, you'd feel guilty. And you would've." She was right. I would've. I didn't speak for a long time. I just sat there, tea cooling in my hand, mind spinning through every moment I had held Dylan in contempt, every judgment, every comment, every cutting silence. And while none of that excused the man he had become, it complicated the image I had crafted of him in my mind. He wasn't just a leech, or a coward, or a failure clinging to the edges of responsibility. He had made a choice once, a choice that cost him something, to protect me, and he had never asked for credit. So I left my mother's house with a bitter knot in my chest and a phone full of unanswered calls from Dylan. I didn't know what I was going to say to him, if I was going to say anything at all, but I knew that ignoring him wouldn't bring me peace anymore. There was no clean moral line anymore. No easy division between who was right and who was wrong. There was just a mess. A shared, tangled, decades-old mess that none of us had the courage to clean up until it started rotting from the inside. But fate, as it often does, beat me to the punch. Because when I got home that evening, Laura was sitting on my porch. Her coat was zipped up to her chin, a small suitcase by her feet, and her eyes were swollen but dry. I opened the door without a word, and she stood slowly, walking past me like she already knew she was welcome, not because I had said so, but because there was no other place to go. We sat on the couch, the same couch where I had listened to Dylan's voicemails and planned my quiet revenge, and she said, "I'm leaving him." I nodded. I expected that. What I didn't expect was what came next. But not for what you think, she added. I turned to her, puzzled, waiting. I'm not leaving because he lied. Or because he took your help and spat on it. Or because he cheated, even though that broke something I can't fix. I'm leaving because now I see what he really is. And what you've become. I stared at her, stunned, the words landing harder than any of Dylan's accusations ever could. What I've become? I asked, barely above a whisper. She looked at me, eyes unwavering. You built your strength around his weakness. You kept helping, yes, but only so you could feel like the one who had it together. You say you wanted to help, but you never wanted to be equal. You wanted to be owed. I didn't have a response, because part of me knew she was right. She stood, grabbed her bag, and before leaving, said something I'll never forget, because it was the final, brutal truth none of us had dared to say aloud. You and Dylan are two sides of the same coin. He lies to survive. You help to control. And I'm done playing the game. She walked out into the night, and I let her. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't peaceful. Because the truth was, I hadn't won anything. And maybe that's the worst part of revenge. It doesn't restore what was broken. It just shifts the weight of the damage. I sat there alone, the Thanksgiving leftovers still in the fridge, uneaten, growing cold and forgotten like every version of the past we had all tried to protect. And I realized that this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of reckoning.